Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Okay, so today we're tackling utilitarianism.
Ooh, a classic.
Yeah, and to get into it, we're looking at excerpts from John Stuart Mill's Utilitarianism.
One of the big ones.
Definitely. So in this deep dive, we'll be exploring whether happiness is really the ultimate goal and how justice fits in.
And maybe even more interesting, like why some utilitarians think their own standard is too high.
Yeah. Too high for, like, us regular humans to even achieve.
Exactly. Like it's a fascinating thing that Mill tries to clear up,
Uh-huh.
you know, what utilitarianism actually is.
And what it isn't.
Yeah, there are a lot of misconceptions out there.
So let's start with the basics, I guess. What is utilitarianism?
Basically, it comes down to judging actions based on their outcomes. So an action is right if it leads to happiness
Okay.
and wrong if it leads to, well, the opposite, unhappiness.
So, like, creating the most happiness for the most people.
Yeah, but it's not quite that simple. When Mill's talking about happiness, he's referring to pleasure
Pleasure.
in the absence of pain.
Okay, so like maximizing pleasure, minimizing pain
Hmm.
for as many people as possible.
Right, but Mill argues that not all pleasures are, created equal. He actually says that mental pleasures,
Mental pleasures.
yeah, like using your intellect or enjoying art, imagination, even experiencing moral sentiments,
Yeah.
those are considered superior to just like physical pleasures.
So, like, indulging in a giant pizza, that's,
Not exactly the highest form of happiness, according to Mill. He might say there's room for both in a good life, though.
right, right. So it's not that those things are bad, but
But they're not the whole picture. He emphasizes that a really fulfilling life, it needs a balance of tranquility and excitement.
tranquility and excitement. Got it.
And those deeper, mental pleasures, they're a key part of that.
Makes sense. So if happiness is the goal here, how does Mill even define
Well,
happiness?
that's where things get really interesting. Because, I
Yeah.
mean, you've probably heard the argument that, like, true happiness is just, unattainable.
Yeah, right.
So how can it be the foundation for, like a whole ethical system?
Hmm.
Mill even quotes Thomas Carlyle, who asks, "What right hast thou to be happy?"
Whoa. Yeah, what right do we have? What does Mill say to that?
He says utilitarians aren't like aiming for constant ecstasy. It's not about being like blissed out all the time.
Okay.
Happiness in this context is more about a life where, the pleasure outweighs the pain.
Makes sense?
And he believes this is actually possible, especially if we like create the right kind of society.
Okay, that makes sense. But here's another question that pops up for me. Like, why should I care about, the greatest good for the greatest number if it doesn't directly benefit me? What motivates people to be moral if not for their own happiness?
That's a good question. And it's important to remember that this actually applies to any moral system, not just utilitarianism.
Hmm.
Like, think about it. No matter what your moral code is, there are consequences for your actions. Sometimes those consequences come from other people, like being rewarded for doing something good or punished for,
Yeah,
breaking a law. Those are external sanctions.
right, like external pressures.
Exactly. But Mill also focuses on what he calls conscientious feelings, that little voice inside that tells you if you've done something right or wrong,
Our conscience.
right? Like our internal moral compass. Those are internal sanctions.
Guiding us to do what feels right, even if no one's watching, no reward, no punishment.
Exactly. And Mill was actually pretty optimistic about this. He thought that these feelings, they're not like totally innate. They're cultivated like any other skill.
So we can develop them.
Yeah, he felt they could be just as strong for someone following, utilitarian principles as for anyone else.
So our sense of duty, of responsibility, can be shaped to support that utilitarian perspective.
That's the idea. And to go even further, Mill says we have this social feeling, like a natural desire to be in unity with others. And this, he argued, could be a powerful motivator for acting in ways that promote the general happiness. He believed that as societies progress, that social feeling, it just keeps getting stronger.
Interesting. It makes you wonder if we are, like, naturally wired to want to care about each other to build a more harmonious society. But, one of the biggest things people bring up about utilitarianism is this. How can you prove happiness is the only thing we desire? I mean, we desire things like knowledge, virtue, right?
Yeah.
Not just as a means to happiness, but for their own sake.
It's a great question, and Mill has a really interesting response. He argues that we desire things because they're pleasurable, even if that connection isn't always obvious at first.
Okay.
So even when we want, knowledge or virtue, we're seeking them out because they bring some kind of, like, satisfaction, make us feel good.
So even those like higher
They
pursuits,
still tie back to pleasure or satisfaction.
right, but it's not always so direct. It's not just about like immediate gratification.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Of course, he recognizes we don't always act for immediate pleasure. Like, willpower and habits play a role too. But he uses a really interesting example, the love of money.
Money.
Right.
Okay. Tell me more.
So he says, initially, we want money because it helps us get things that make us happy, right?
Yeah, the things money can buy.
But for some people, the desire for money itself, it kind of evolves. It becomes more than just a tool. It becomes part of their happiness.
It's like the money itself brings them pleasure.
Right. And Mill compares this to virtue. He says, just like that love of money can become, like, intrinsic, so can the love of virtue. It gets woven into how we see ourselves and contributes to our overall happiness.
Okay, I think I'm getting that. But what about justice? I feel like this is where a lot of people get stuck with utilitarianism. It seems like justice is on a whole other level, a higher standard than just utility.
That's a huge question. How do justice and utility relate?
Right. It's a big one.
Yeah.
And it seems like something we need to, dive into deeper.
Absolutely.
Okay, so justice. Big topic. Are we saying we should just like ditch it and focus only on happiness?
Not at all. Mill actually sees them as connected.
Connected. Okay. How so?
He gets that justice. It can feel super intense, maybe even stronger than just wanting things that are convenient or practical.
Yeah.
But he says it's all about protecting rights, which ultimately leads to the common good.
Okay, so protecting rights is good for everyone. Got it. But what about punishment?
Ooh, interesting.
That seems tied to justice, but it doesn't always feel like it's promoting happiness, especially if it's driven by, like, revenge.
Good point. Mill says the desire to punish, it's natural. Even animals do it.
Right.
But for humans, it becomes moral when it's, for the benefit of society as a whole.
So more about preventing future harm or helping the person change, not just getting even.
Exactly. And that intensity we feel about justice, he says it comes from needing security, like basic security, which is essential for well-being.
Makes sense.
He actually emphasizes that justice, it's not this simple rule that's easy to apply in every situation.
Yeah, it can get tricky.
Even though a lot of people think of it that way. Like, look at debates about taxes or punishments. Totally different views on what's just.
It's true. What's considered just can change depending on the situation and, like, the values people hold.
Totally. And this is where Mill says something really interesting. He says, you know that feeling we have about justice? Sometimes it's not even reliable.
What? You mean our gut feeling could be wrong?
That's exactly what he's saying. He points out that people often disagree strongly about what's just as much as they disagree about what's beneficial. He uses examples, too.
Examples. Always love a good example. What kind of examples?
Well, like, take the idea of punishing someone as an example for others. Some people, they think that's totally unjust. They argue punishment should only be for the good of the person being punished. But then others, they say, hold on, it's unjust to punish someone for their own good. That's like forcing them.
Yeah.
Punishment is only okay to prevent harm to others.
So two completely different ideas of what's just, even on a topic like punishment.
Exactly. And he gives another one. Think about a business, right? People working together.
Okay, yeah.
Is it just for someone with more talent, more skill, to get paid more?
Ooh, that's relevant. With all the talk about income inequality, fair wages.
Absolutely. And Mill, he lays out both sides. On one hand, you could say everyone putting in their best effort deserves equal pay.
Right. Regardless of their ability.
Yeah. Because it doesn't seem fair to give someone more just because they're more skilled. Especially since they might already have advantages like being admired or influential.
So they're already ahead in a way.
Right. But then the other argument says, hold on, the more skilled worker contributes more.
So they should get more of the reward.
Exactly. To deny them that would be like stealing from them. Plus, if everyone gets paid the same, no matter how much they do, well, people might not try as hard.
So both sides have a point.
Right, making it super hard to figure out what's truly fair. And Mill, he doesn't stop there. He talks about taxes, too.
Taxes.
Classic debate. Who should pay how much?
Some say flat tax. Everyone pays the same percentage no matter their income.
Others say no, progressive taxation. Those who earn more pay a higher percentage. And then, get this, there's the idea that everyone should just pay the same amount.
Whoa, like a membership fee to be in society.
Right. Now, even though that one's not super popular, The principle behind it, that everyone benefits equally from things like legal protection, so they should all contribute the same, that's tough to dismiss as unjust.
It is interesting to think about. Okay, so if our ideas about justice can be so unreliable, what are we supposed to use to make choices? What guides us?
And that leads us right to Mill's main argument.
Yeah.
He's not saying justice is meaningless or we should ignore it. Actually, he says justice, when it's grounded in utility, is like the most sacred part of morality.
So justice is important, but it's not separate from utility. It's actually based on it.
Exactly. And he's not saying it's less important either. He says it's the most important part because it's about those basic things we need to be okay as humans.
So it's justice as utility, not justice versus utility.
Perfect.
Yeah.
When we see it that way, it's essential for building a society where we can work together, benefit each other, it keeps us safe, makes things fair, and ultimately, yeah, leads to more happiness overall.
This is really shifting my thinking. But if justice can be like unreliable at times and it's based on utility, why does it feel so powerful, so important to us?
Great question. It takes us to the final part of exploring utilitarianism.
Okay, so we've talked about how justice has this strong hold on us, even if it's ultimately grounded in utility. It's not just another rule, it's almost like sacred.
It's fascinating how Mill connects that feeling to how important justice is for, our well-being. It's not that justice is just random, but its strength comes from how much we need it to, function as a society.
So even though it's about the greater good, it feels different because it deals with things that are essential for, the very existence of society.
Exactly. Think about those core principles, protecting us from harm, treating everyone fairly.
Those are the basics.
They're the bedrock. Without them, we'd be constantly on edge, seeing everyone as a threat.
Yeah, it would be exhausting living like that. Always suspicious.
Totally. And not only do we each want those rules to be followed, but we want to make sure other people follow them too. We all benefit from a society where justice prevails.
So it's like this shared understanding, it lets us trust each other, work together.
Exactly. Mill really emphasizes how those basic principles, the ones about harm and fairness, they shape how we feel about each other. Allies or enemies, partners or rivals, it all goes back to that.
Makes sense. But what about that feeling we get when we think about justice? It's strong. More than just doing what's convenient for us. How does Mill explain that?
This is where he brings in a really interesting point. Our desire for punishment.
Punishment. That doesn't sound very, positive.
I know, right?
Yeah.
But Mill points out wanting to punish those who do wrong, it's actually natural. We see it even in animals. But what makes it moral for us is when it's guided by concern for everyone, for the common good.
So not revenge, it's more about making sure the system works for everybody.
Exactly. And that intensity we feel, that sense that some wrongs just have to be punished, it comes from how much we need security.
Security is basic.
It's fundamental.
Right.
We can live without a lot of things, but without security, nothing else really matters. It's the foundation for everything else.
Like if you don't feel safe, you can't focus on anything else.
Totally. And because that need is so universal, we expect others to feel it too. We rely on them to uphold those rules, and when someone breaks them, it triggers a huge reaction in us.
Like breaking a promise, but on a societal level.
Exactly. And that's why Mill argues that even though justice is ultimately derived from utility, it feels different, more important, more compelling. It's not just about being happy in some abstract way. It's about protecting the very things that let us, exist together, thrive.
So it's not just an idea, it's tied to our deepest instincts.
Absolutely. And those instincts, they come with a lot of feeling.
Wow. Okay, so after this deep dive, it seems like utilitarianism, even though people misunderstand it, is a really interesting and complex approach to ethics.
Definitely complex.
It's about happiness, but it also recognizes how complicated we are. It values things like justice, individual rights.
It definitely has its critics, raises some tough questions.
Yeah.
But it gives us a way to think about making moral choices, building a society that cares about everyone's well-being.
It's definitely given me a lot to think about.
Me too. And as you continue to reflect on it, think about this. Mill said that as societies progress, we naturally feel more connected, more united with each other. Do you think that's happening today? And if it is, what does that mean for how we deal with justice in the world around us?
That's a great question, one we all need to consider. And until next time, keep diving deeper.